There are 3 gift bags right down here at stage right, which you can collect if your name is called. Can I get a drum roll from folks in the room? That was pretty weak, but I'll take it. We've got Ted White. Ted White? Is Ted in the room? Okay. If you are called, but you're not in the room, we'll put your name back in for later draws. Okay. How about Rick Shaw from Wikinuke? Rick Shaw. Woohoo! Way to go, Rick. Come on up and collect your prize. Yeah, put your hands together for Rick Shaw. Can I get another drum roll? That's better. We're getting there. We've got Patrick Mitchell from Kanaka Bar. Patrick Mitchell? Oh, Michelle, pardon me. Patrick Michelle. Okay. How about Tom Koenig from West Bank? Tom from West Bank, are you in the room? I think it just works better when we do the drum roll. So let's have another one of those. We have Vera Pisi from Hamalco. Oh, congratulations, Vera. Is she in the room? Yes, she's in the back of the room, and we'll bring your gift to you. Yeah. She's got a... Okay, final drum roll. Cindy Inrig from Weewakai. Cindy, are you in the room? Right on. There's our 3rd prize winner. Let's put our hands together one more time for our 3rd and final prize winner for the morning. And again, thank you to the Summit for those prizes. We'll be doing more, as I said, after lunch for completed client service questionnaires from Indigenous Services Canada. So if you want your name in that draw, make sure you go to the Ask Me booth and collect a copy of that very brief 1-page questionnaire, and we'll be doing more prize draws after lunch. And with that, I will turn it over to my lovely co-moderator, Harold.
All right, thank you very much for that, and congratulations to the winners. So we will now turn to the plenary remarks by the honourable ministers that are joining us. And just by way of the process, I do want to invite them to the staging area with the Joint Grand Chief Ed John, who will help us with the introductions. So I'll ask Minister Bennett and Minister O'Regan, along with Senior Assistant Deputy Minister Joe Wild and Deputy Minister Jean-François Tremblay to please make their way to the staging area. Just by sequence, we'll have each of the ministers, after the Grand Chief's introductory remarks, we'll look to each of the ministers for their remarks, and then we'll open the floor up until the lunch hour. With that, please help me welcome back to the podium Grand Chief Ed John.
Thank you again, Harold. I really appreciate the opportunity to take a minute or two to introduce the 2 speakers that we have next. As the National Chief did, I want to acknowledge your staff who do tremendous work with you and working on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations, Dakota. Dakota is here, is your political advisor. He's somewhere, big tall guy, red hair. Cindy Woodhouse and Caleb Ben. Caleb doesn't need no introduction in this place. He's from BC, he's from Fort Nelson. Father's Richard. But his grandfather was a long-standing chief in the community, many years. involved in the affairs of our people for so many years. Can't even recall how many years. I'd like to also introduce the minister's, Minister Bennett's assistant, Sarah Welch, and Minister O'Regan's assistant, Jessica Hayden. These ladies, important contact points for the ministers who are so busy. They never ever want to give you their cell phone numbers, so you talk to them. In this province, to the two ministers in particular, and the deputy and this associate senior deputy minister, Joe Weil, senior deputy assistant, senior deputy, senior assistant deputy. He said it was a long-winded title. This province, what we have typically done is we come to governments, whether it's in Victoria or in Ottawa, with proposals, solutions. We don't really spend a lot of time complaining, but we'll fight about the issues that are so important to us. But we always come with solutions. As one of our elder chiefs said, Clarence Jules, is you can't fix a flat tire by yelling at it. And it is true. Try yelling at your next flat tire, see how far you get, and then phone BCAA or do it yourself. I wanted to, with the introduction to Minister Bennett, who requires really no introduction to probably all of you because she's been the minister and has visited probably, well, in every tribal area in this province and many of our communities since her appointment as a minister, and then with the split between INAC, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada was called, and then it was some other name, and you know we can't really keep track of it anymore. Now it's the Minister for Indigenous Relations Canada, CIRNA, and just so you know a bit about the background, she's a medical doctor, a family physician. In a way, too, during the course of spring and the summer, my doctor, when I had my medical issue, her and actually Dr. Philpott, so I had two cabinet ministers who were also providing advice to me, and in May and into the summer when I had this, I was in this really difficult place in my own life physically, and thank them for their advice. She was first elected to the House of Commons in 1997, and then re-elected in 2000, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2011, 2015. Sounds like my elections. I was elected at the summit for 11 terms, so you're close, but not yet. She's an advocate for health in the area of health, the environment, women's involvement in politics, and persons with disabilities. But now the role that she has is dealing with the Crown Indigenous Relations with a mandate from the Prime Minister. Wanted to, the representative from Nuhawk mentioned about being and continuing to be sovereign peoples, and you know, I think in British Columbia it's fair to say that we all think like that. Even though we are negotiating with the governments, we negotiate because we have sovereignty, sovereign authority, inherent rights. And I want to quote from the Haida decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, where it said that treaties serve to reconcile assumed Crown sovereignty with pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty. Build those words into your agreements. They're important because now where we have a foundation for what the Prime Minister talked about, nation-to-nation relationship and government-to-government relationship, an important foundation. Prime Minister gave a mandate to the Minister to talk about rights recognition and implementation. What does that mean? What does it include? And I've always come to this one place. What have the courts said about Aboriginal title, Aboriginal rights? What they said was Aboriginal title exists in British Columbia, and that it is a legal interest in land. A legal interest in land. It's like the Crown's legal interest in land when they talk about Crown title. So when the RCMP were getting ready to go into the Wet'suwet'en territory very recently, they came out with a statement that they released saying that there is no Aboriginal title in British Columbia. Aboriginal title has not been declared, they said, anywhere in British Columbia. How fundamentally wrong they were. Anyway, so that's not my speech. It's up to it's my views, but you know that's what we've stood on in this province for so many years. And in the scheme of things, these mandates that the two ministers have, and in particular on this issue of rights recognition and implementation, I want to introduce to you Minister Bennett, we want to thank her for being here and taking and presenting and answering questions. But so I don't have to come back up here and introduce the newest minister, Minister O'Regan, Seamus O'Regan. So if you want to get on his good Irish side, you say O'Regan. And if you want to kind of piss him off, like an Englishman would, you call him O'Regan. I just made that up, actually. You know, Minister, I really appreciate that you took up our offer to be here. He was appointed last Monday, and Perry was talking, the National Chief was talking about the Prime Minister and the AFN convening a session of ministers and leaders, First Nations, regional chiefs, the National Chief, and I was invited to attend. He walked into the room to attend the meeting. I walked right up to him. I said, Minister, congratulations. Next week we're going to have a meeting in British Columbia and you're invited to come. And he said, I've only been a minister 4 hours. I said, well, that's a long time already. So really appreciate that he took the opportunity, capacity building, today's theme in governance and in administration. And we do have, of course, Perry submitted a proposal to both ministers by doing this A. I have a written proposal to you on the issue of First Nations public service, our public servants, the people in here who work in our communities, the First Nations public service. You know, I see Canada and the Canadian Public Service Commission, I think it's called, who are responsible for training and looking after the welfare and the well-being of all of the Canada's public servants. And we don't have that. We don't have that support that we need. So we've talked to JF about it, talked to the clerk of the Privy Council and the new deputy clerk for the Privy Council and have advanced the idea we need Canada's support to ensure that we have ongoing training and support for the development of our public servants. You know, there's heavily criticized that we don't manage our governments well or our administration. And then I look at the report from yesterday in the Legislative Assembly and where there's an $80 million budget and the clerk and some kind of sergeant are in some kind of difficulty, put it that way. So it's nothing new to any governments, whether it's federal or provincial or municipal governments or First Nations governments. There's always challenges, but the way to combat those challenges is to have good, well-trained professional public service in our communities, working for our people. So I wanted to introduce Minister Seamus O'Regan. He's a member of Parliament for St. John's South and Mount Pearl. Studied at St. Francis Xavier University and University College Dublin in Ireland. And went Master of Philosophy degree from the University of Cambridge in England. And he also worked as a minister assistant to the Minister of Justice and as a senior policy advisor to Premier Brian Tobin. National Chief said when he was talking about fisheries, he wanted some bullets. All of the coastal communities could use some bullets because we have a really overabundance of sea lions and seals. So I was wondering what kind of bullets you were talking about. Talk to the chiefs from the coast, they'll tell you. So I told the minister I went to an Indian residential schools where the priests and the nuns and the brothers were all Irish Catholic. And then when he heard that, he said, "You just really shot up in my eyes." No, he didn't say that. I made that up too. So with that, I would like to introduce Minister Bennett.
I don't know, is there an extra fee for the cover charge? I don't know. Hello, bonjour, and thank you, Grand Chief, I think, for the kind introduction, and I think that in my rather rusty family physician role, I think the only thing we prescribed for you, sir, was rest, and to listen to the red light on the dashboard and mainly listen to Wendy, I think was what we said, and but it is a great honor to be included in this meeting of the joint gathering on the Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples. But we also recognize that at really important events like this, that really is about a relationship, and we thank the Grand Chief for really the idea that got us to this point. He was just telling me how this had happened under Deputy Minister Scott Serson nationally, but then BC just chose to keep this going because this is really about relationships. But I also think that as the Grand Chief said, that the real importance in building a strong public service and relationships between the two public services, nation to nation, government to government, is really where we're trying to go, and how we do need one another's cell phone numbers, actually, Grand Chief, and that's sort of how we get stuff done. And it was interesting, as the National Chief mentioned at the meeting with the Prime Minister, that, you know, this idea of having lawyers' letters answered 6 months later is not really the way we're going to get stuff done at the speed with which we want to do it. And that we actually do think that if we can fix things in regions, if we can fix things just official to official, when it's really obvious what needs to be done, that's, I think, why we're all here today. And it is also, I think, important, Grand Chief, to thank you for your leadership on the International Year of Indigenous Languages and the work that you will do next week in Paris and then in New York. So it is, we are just, I think, very grateful that the body betrayal has stopped. That was my most famous diagnosis, that somehow when the mind is willing and the body betrays us, that just seems so unfair for people who contribute at the level that you do. But we want really to thank the Leadership Council, Indigenous Services, the BC regional staff, the TAG Negotiating West staff, and everyone here for for organizing and hosting this 7th joint gathering. I think particularly humbled today in that yesterday we were in Arviat doing the apology and for the Ahariut people and about a forced relocation. The lunch with the elders is something I will never forget. To meet Mary, who was with her newborn baby on the front of the 1957 Life magazine, being able to tell her story to me before I'm giving the apology on behalf of the Government of Canada. To meet the elder who had been placed in a snowbank as a child and watched her baby sister die in her arms, singing a hymn to her last breath. To meet the family that became known because of starvation, because of the difficulty that the woman whose husband had been killed literally by his best friend, and then she was accused of murdering the friend, and all that took in that community, that all caused by Canada. This was caused because of terrible decisions that Canada made in terms of these forced relocations that kept going on for these people. And so I think that it is really important that as we do our work together, getting the 95% of Canadians not from Indigenous background with the program and understanding why the work that you are all doing is so important, that we make sure that we fill in these gaps of the darkest chapters of the history of Canada to all Canadians, so they understand what it is we're doing and how we have to go forward in a much better way that really is about a partnership, and it is about the original spirit of the treaties and of the relationship that was to be here. I think we all and the Grand Chief would agree, that when we were in Chilcotin and were there with the chiefs in the portrait of the nooses, the empty nooses, the exoneration with the Prime Minister, we really felt that was a milestone in going forward in a much better way. But I also think that for those of us that were there, to be in that amazing land surrounded by mountains, to me there was no question about title. There was no question that those people had lived there for time immemorial, and that we actually need to get on with the program of actually getting to do the tough work that it will be to realize the dreams of self-determination, self-government, and title. It is, I think, the work that we thank the National Chief and all of the chiefs and council members here, the administrators of the communities across BC, all your institutions and organizations, all the people manning those booths outside that are doing their piece in moving us forward, creating capacity and building so that you can build your governments and write your laws. But I do want to particularly thank the National Chief for his platform advice, I think, it's good? Okay. But also acknowledge that 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, as well as Grand Chief Stuart Phillips' 20th year as UBCIC president. I am so thrilled to be here with my friend, Seamus O'Regan. This is an amazing guy. As an advocate and all of his scholarly work that was done on Indigenous rights, all of the firsthand information and life experience he has for growing up in Goose Bay. But mainly he's been my friend and seatmate. He's been my friend for a long time. He's been my seatmate in Canada at the cabinet table for a short while. But in his role as co-chair of the Reconciliation Committee of Cabinet, he was just this amazing ally where I would go to him for advice. In that a lot of the things that we take to cabinet have a rather large price tag. A lot of the things we take to cabinet need some persuasion of the other people at the table about why this is important or why there really isn't another way to do this, and that we have to go with the kinds of agreements and the kinds of things that have been co-developed with our partners. And to have Seamus there as the vice chair of the committee has been unbelievably important in terms of how we do our work together. And I just want to say thank you. I know people think that you've got big shoes to fill in terms of Minister Philpott, and I agree that was a person who wanted to get stuff done. But I think that we both agree that the work that we have all done together, co-developing plans for improving the quality of life of your communities, is a very clear blueprint that will be executed by all of the people in this room with this amazing leadership of Minister O'Regan. I have heard that and know and feel that some of the remaniement, the cabinet shuffle, has been difficult for people here in British Columbia, and I want to reassure you that my friend Jody Wilson-Raybould will be very, very important in terms of her invaluable advice on anything on the path to reconciliation, and that we thank her so much, and particularly, as the National Chief said, for the litigation directive that's come forward and all of the things that she has done in terms of her wise counsel. But I also want to tell you that Minister Lametti will also be a tremendous friend of all of us in this room in the work that he did as law professor on human rights, on the Constitution, and on Indigenous rights, and how again, he has been very, very important as we move into this whole of government approach, that we get to add one more person to our posse as we move forward, that one more minister who really gets it. And I think that a lot of you have, with Minister Wilkinson, Minister Champagne, Carr, Rodriguez, Haidú, Duclos, LeBlanc, Petitpot, Taylor, these are all people who are starting to really, really understand and become tremendous advocates for what it is, not only what you want to do, but how you want to do it in partnership and in a co-developed way. So we really are here, I think, to say thank you to BC, to the summit, to UBCIC, the FN Chief Terry Teegee, Regional Chief, and all of the chiefs in the room for the leadership and the innovative thinking, for the dedication and hard work that you are all rolling up your sleeves to get this done. And it means that through working in real partnership, I believe we've been able to make real progress here in British Columbia, not only at your treaty tables, but also in any path that you have chosen to sit down and work with us on your path to self-determination and self-government. So it is being because of vision and the kind of commitment and persistence that your communities understand what it is to pursue inherent in treaty rights. It is about the leadership in hard work. But I also think that every so often we need to take a minute and thank you, in that I think that even in your communities, you need to be able to take back to your communities how important it is to us that you do this work in committee, that it's time that you're not in your communities. It's time where things are still happening in your communities, but you're at a meeting. And I want you to be able to say, we are so grateful for the work that you are doing by coming together and making real progress and helping us write down, whether it's drafting instructions, whether it's the kinds of work that we need to be able to actually articulate how we want to work together in the future. And so I am really pleased that in that ongoing challenge of getting out from under the Indian Act that we're really overwhelmed by the number of nations that have come to us asking for some funding to support that nation rebuilding projects, and that we have been able to right now be able to approve 25 of those projects, and that is $4.75 million just in the first year. And then we'll need your advice. How do we tweak this? How do we make sure it's flexible, and how we can go forward again to do what it says in my mandate letter: accelerate the progress to self-determination. So you in BC have clearly demonstrated that our processes need to work for your communities, that the top-down approach is paternalism. We're saying, it says no longer work, but I would like to say they never did. That paternalism, as Nellie Cornwell used to say, paternalism has been a total failure. And I used to feel that as a feminist. I now understand that this is an Indigenous reality of bottom up, of being able to listen to community and find consensus, and be able to find what new information people will need in order to be able to take a decision on a path forward. I think that when we stood side by side in October with the Stalo, Wew'lumuk, and the province of British Columbia, I learned a lot just in the drive out there in terms of what stage 5 treaty negotiations could mean if it was done differently than the paint-by-number approach that had been originally there. The 6 Stolo communities didn't feel that the treaty process worked for them. And so now we work together on agreed to a core treaty, which will establish a collaborative and predictable government-to-government relationship that can evolve over time. This is something that needs to be in plain language. It means that generations to come have to understand what was signed and what are the obligations placed on Canada in that core treaty. And I think that the side agreements and the legalese can be somewhere else. But for us to be very clear in the language, and that was very clearly stated at the table with Ktunaxa, and again at the table with Stolo. This is very clear as we move forward to do things differently. As you know, in November, we were also able to sign the Rights Recognition and Core Treaty between Ktunaxa and Chief Negotiator Catherine Tenise with the BC government, Minister Scott Fraser in Canada. Again, all 3 parties have agreed to explore a new approach that involves the negotiation of a core treaty that would be much more flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. The core treaty recognizes Ktunaxa's existing Section 35 rights, and in key areas it sets out the broad principles for how those rights would be recognized. And we're just hugely grateful to people that have done the thinking and the work to take us down this path in an exciting new way. That agreement recognizes the Ktunaxa Nation Council as the legal government and the rights holders of the Ktunaxa Nation. We believe that this innovative approach that is being advocated for in British Columbia is showing results that are truly paving the way for the rest of the country. We will also develop together a rights recognition agreement that will include recognition of the Ktunaxa Nation as a legal entity before a treaty is implemented. So the Rights Recognition and Core Treaty MOU will enable us to finalize a treaty within the BC treaty process in a way that best supports the Ktunaxa Nation's community's vision of self-determination. As you know, we are also inspired by the work that we've been doing with the Helsik Nation and the incorporating of the role of hereditary chiefs, the structure of their new government to write their own laws as they move to self-government, and again, the ongoing reality of the need for great public servants like in this room, and how you actually are ready to build a government. So I'm pretty excited that tomorrow when I get to sit down with the students at UVic in the law school that are exploring the traditional legal practices, and that as Joe Wild says to me, one day Canada's laws will not just be civil and common law, but they will incorporate Indigenous law in the way that we write the laws of Canada, and whatever secret place that the drafters sit in, whatever building it is there in Justice, that there will be Indigenous people making sure that this is in keeping, and Indigenous scholars in keeping with the Indigenous laws and the original intent of the relationship. In December, the First Nations Summit, Canada and British Columbia, signed the Principles Accord on transforming treaty negotiations in Canada. And again, we thank Grand Chief Ed John, but also Cheryl Casimir and Robert Phillips for their leadership on getting to this important step. This accord was signed because we all recognize that we have to take a different approach so that we can get to treaty faster. And I think that some of the changes we've made obviously recognize the kinds of frustrations that so many of you have felt. That I don't ever think that we should be in a room where there's a community $30 million in debt that spent 20 years trying to get to treaty. This is unacceptable, and it's a deterrent to other people to join this hard work and journey of self-determination. So what we're hoping is what we are creating now is a new approach that removes the impediments and obstacles that have been long present in treaty negotiations in this promise. I think we all agree that extinguishment and surrender have no place in the modern treaty process. And the new approach to the BC treaty negotiations is based instead on the recognition and implementation of rights. And somebody asked me the other day, when the self-governing nations were in Ottawa, that why are the Gwich'in at two tables? They're at one table to move on self-determination as quickly as possible. They're at another table to modernize the treaty that they have that will deal with these things like extinguishment and surrender, that we have to modernize and refresh the things that were signed so that we no longer have to hear termination and all of the things that are actually inaccurate if we are going to work together in the way that you choose to have your relationship with Canada. So through the Accord, the principles have endorsed the co-development of negotiation mandates in partnership with First Nations at individual treaty negotiation tables, and the co-development of policies through broader collective processes involving multiple Indigenous nations. We know that this represents a significant shift in how the federal government negotiates treaties and what we are able to bring to the table. Most of you in this room know that in the past, Canada went to Cabinet, sought a mandate, and then negotiated within that mandate with the community. I think some of you know that I spent enough time in opposition to understand that that didn't work. That Canada would show up with a take it or leave it, see you in court approach, and that mandate was fixed. It was, in some ways, the mandate was Canada's final offer. Now, Indigenous priorities are respected and acknowledged to be on an equal footing with those of the Crown. And so, as we move forward as true partners in advancing reconciliation and supporting Indigenous nations' self-determination, that this becomes extremely important. That the rules are set of how we will work with one another. The other piece that the self-governing nations have really articulated to us, and which was part of what the Land Claim Coalition put forward years ago, was the need for an oversight mechanism. And we are very grateful that the BC Modern Treaty Alliance has been very involved in that kind of work, but it is about changes to the Interpretation Act around non-derogation, but it also is about how do we make sure when Canada signs an agreement that there is an oversight mechanism to make sure Canada did what they said they'd do, when they sign the agreement. I think we've had good success with the deputy ministers committee on treaty implementation. I think it's been very important, I think, because of the leadership of the Prime Minister, but also of our deputy, that all the deputies come to those meetings, and we are trying to fix things and including fish. So it's this is a place where problems are sorted out at the deputy level, but people are saying we need perhaps another oversight body that takes it up the next step. The Land Claim Coalition had thought it should be housed in the Auditor General's office. We think that would put too many constraints on it in terms of who picks the people that are there, and that maybe something freestanding that we would like to look at that would report directly to Parliament. But this is the work that we're now doing on what that oversight body or process should look like. And Grand Chief Ed John has suggested that perhaps this year at the UN Permanent Forum that it could be a side event that Canada would host to see what other countries are doing. I know that New Zealand and others have a way, and we can learn from what's working there and what's not working in other jurisdictions. So outside the treaty process, I think that we are making good progress in recognizing and operationalizing First Nations jurisdiction over child and family services. As you know, Canada, together with the province of British Columbia, have signed tripartite MOUs with the Secwepemc Nation on October 17th and with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs on October 11th. These letters of understanding will support their communities in caring for their children according to their own traditions and culture. And I must say, coast to coast to coast, asserting jurisdiction on children and families is a huge incentive for nations to rebuild and for communities to really do the work to say, we will write our own laws, we have our laws on children, we will go forward in our own way, and no longer, as the National Chief said, would Section 88 of the Indian Act apply to our nation. So we think that this provides real clarity on the path to self-determination and with the goal of transferring jurisdiction over child and family wellness to the First Nations. As I say often, to me, this is about the rights and well-being of Indigenous children and youth to be raised in their culture, in their language. It's their right, not only in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, but also in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is the way we need to go forward, and what we are doing now by forcibly removing children from their families is against the principles of the UN Declaration, and I know my colleague will have more to say about that. So tomorrow, Canada and BC will sign an LOU with Cowichan tribes, and the LOU supports the development of a framework and process for Cowichan tribes to exercise their jurisdiction over the protection, care, and nurture of their children according to their traditions and culture. You'll notice that the provincial government has been involved in every one of these examples of progress, and I do want to acknowledge and thank Scott Fraser, the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, for his unwavering personal commitment and willingness to work together to support and advance First Nations self-determination. We love his phrase of being a disruptor of the status quo. This level of true collaboration and genuine partnership is unique in Canada, and I think that lots of people see this as a huge opportunity as we commend the BC government for this excellent work that we are doing together, and the example is for the country. So I just want to also thank all of you for your hard work over the past year on the work we are undertaking together on reforming federal laws and policies. I don't think I can emphasize enough how important our conversations have been in informing our thinking on how to go forward in true partnership, working together to develop the legislative and policy options to ensure that inherent and treaty rights are recognized and implemented. So we are really grateful for the submission of your drafting instructions and the amount of time and energy it took away from the important work in your communities to ensure that it was properly reflective of the views of First Nations in British Columbia. I think that from February 14th, when the Prime Minister gave his speech in the House of Commons, to by April you had a 3-day retreat drilling down and wanting to do the work, it is just always so impressive how much work you are prepared to do here, and how other parts of the country are looking. How come BC got to do that 3-day retreat? Well, because they actually did the work and prepared it and were ready to go at this opportunity. So we believe that it is our work together that needs to change the federal laws and policies. As we've said many, many times, that the rights of Indigenous people have to be the cornerstone of any and all new policies, and only then can we advance the vital work of reconciliation. This is holding Canada to account as to how we behave going forward. So we've heard loud and clear that continued engagement is necessary to follow through on the commitment to reform the antiquated federal laws and policies, and we thank Minister Wilson-Raybould for the work that she did on the working group, and how that laid the track for the new full Cabinet Committee on Reconciliation. Listening carefully is crucial to ensuring that the policy and legislative reforms are actually what actually will set the relationship between us. We, as you know, have been crisscrossing, and we've had sort of over 100 meetings over the last 11 months, and we've heard that there is a consensus to move rapidly on reforming the comprehensive land claims policy and inherent rights policy. I think I said at the meeting with the Prime Minister that we're sort of tired of having Grand Chief Ed John read to us from the website of that antiquated policy, and we think that if whatever we can do so that doesn't happen again, I think would be very good before June, if we can get that done. So we know the policies don't work. They don't respect the UN Declaration. They don't work for your communities, and they don't promote a relationship based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, which is in the mandate letter of every minister in the government. So I was a bit shocked to find out that the first comprehensive land claims policy was announced 46 years ago, and with the primary objective being to achieve certainty with respect to the ownership, use, and management of lands and resources. This certainty was obtained by negotiating an exchange of claims to undefined Aboriginal rights for a clearly defined package of rights and benefits set out in a settlement agreement. The comprehensive land claims policy has borne the brunt of a lot of criticism over the years, and rightly so. We know that the focus on certainty created cumbersome mandating and approval processes. This bogged down negotiations, resulting in huge costs to all parties, especially Indigenous parties who accumulated crippling loan debt. Federal mandates were, for the most part, predetermined and unilateral. Settlement agreements were static and didn't have a lot of room to evolve over time. The inherent right policy was developed 25 years ago to guide self-government negotiations with Indigenous communities, and it does not address the varying governance capacity issues facing Indigenous groups. Incremental funding has also proved problematic, and it's been a real challenge to develop a fair methodology to figure out the actual resources required to implement settlement agreements over the long term. So we know that policy reform is needed, long overdue, and we really are working hard to have this policy reviewed and in place in spring of 2019. That would be a policy that supports the implementation of Indigenous rights and advances self-determination in a much more collaborative way. The focus is on advancing Indigenous peoples' vision of self-determination for the benefit of their communities, but we know that all Canadians benefit from that. And that allows for the co-development of negotiation mandates based on the priorities identified by Indigenous groups. And I think you've heard Joe Wall say that we actually really do start with a blank piece of paper and listen to what the communities want to work on first and how. That has allowed for co-development of the negotiation mandates based on the priorities identified by Indigenous groups. We know that when we co-develop policy together, we can create something that works for your communities, but with your communities. As we're co-developing, we know that it takes work for you to hear back from your communities. It takes time, that you actually have to make sure that the community is with you as you realize your vision. So we, back in 2016, we made a commitment that Canada would collaborate with Indigenous partners to develop together a new fiscal policy for self-governing Indigenous nations. We think this has been a very exciting progress, and maybe there's the crazy slide up there. So 2 years later, in June 2018, the new fiscal policy framework for self-governing nations was approved. To me, it implements key principles of the new fiscal relationship with Canada. One that recognizes that we must fund groups based on citizens and highlights the need to provide funding on the basis of needs. You can see, if you can see any of it, but we will show you how to find it. But this has been a huge incentive. You can see that language and culture is in there. You can see everything the self-governing nations feel they need to be able to fund in order to run their governments is included in this. That this isn't a little from here and a little from here. This is what will it take for me to run a government, for me to have a public service, for me to be able to go forward and govern ourselves. And so it means that this isn't funding a municipal government. This isn't funding all the other criticisms. This is about funding your nation, where language and culture and all of those things are part of your responsibility as a government. And so I guess it is going to be that as I think we know, we want more nations to be able to join this group of self-governing nations, that it means that if there is a collaborative fiscal model determined by those self-governing nations, it makes it more likely that other nations will want to rebuild and get to that goal of having this kind of stable, predictable funding that actually will be enough and adequate for them to run a government. So we think that this collaborative process resulted in that much stronger fiscal policy that better reflects the needs of the people it serves. It strengthened Canada's relationship with those self-governing nations, but also has provided an incentive for others to look at this as a fair model that is actually doable as they come together. And I know some of the nations are looking to this already, and we've been pretty impressed that even the Department of Finance is interested in how this could become an incentive for others to get to that place of self-governing. So we think that one of the other indicators of how serious we are in changing the status quo and making the concrete changes to the old approaches has been the moratorium on own source revenue. We think that was hugely important. It was seriously important, I think, Joe, in our first meeting in Yukon, where I thought, oh my word, if again self-governing nations aren't happy with the relationship, then why would others want to come and join them? And so that to me became we actually have to listen to the self-governing nations and be able to do what it takes to actually design a relationship that is a fiscal policy, but not just about funding. It is about Canada fulfilling the promises that were made under treaties and self-government arrangements, but ensuring that Indigenous groups have the fiscal capacity to fully implement self-government. So before I close, I think that, as the National Chief did, to reiterate some of the points the Prime Minister made at the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in December. The Prime Minister said that reconciliation is not about words, it's about action. It's about closing the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, gaps in housing and clean water and good jobs and in welfare. And for real reconciliation, you need real results. And I think the Prime Minister acknowledged that there is much more work to be done, and indeed there is. I think that we feel that in our arguments, in our advocacy in terms of the moratorium on own source revenue, we felt very strongly that you cannot be clawing back funds while we're still in the business of closing gaps. And so that, and it opens a conversation to resource revenue sharing, to the kinds of things that we know we need to work on with our provincial and territorial counterparts. But we were very pleased when the Prime Minister had mentioned that at a previous meeting of the AFN. So we think that building a new relationship between the Crown and Indigenous people is actually guided by the recognition of rights and decolonizing our laws. It's about moving from paternalism that ended up with the horrible relocations of the Arhumiat people or the hanging of the Chilcotin chiefs, that this is about us moving from paternalism and that under the idea that the settlers thought they knew better or that the colonizers knew better, to a true partnership. But we know that you can't have a partnership unless our partners feel like it's a partnership. And so it will be up to you to actually make sure that on this journey of reconciliation, where we know there will be course corrections, we know the Government of Canada will make mistakes, they will slip back, but this has got to be a journey that is about making sure that as we decolonize the laws, implement the TRC calls to action, fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, preserving language, changing the fiscal relationship, that we are being led by you. It has to be your needs, your aspirations, your vision of self-determination. And I think, as some of you have heard, that as a physician, I always knew when not to prescribe. This is not about me prescribing anything. This is about us listening and making sure that we are there to support you in your vision of self-determination. So we are looking forward to, again, your advice. How do we move faster? How do we accelerate the progress to self-determination? And how do we work in this, as was said, we're not going anywhere. So in this marriage, not a divorce, as we work together. So I just want you to know that we expect that your role is to make sure that we are upholding the honor of the Crown. Your role is to correct us, but your role is to make sure that for generations and generations to come, they will come back and look at a renewed relationship and be grateful that you have spent the time doing your hard work, and hopefully they will be able to say that the Government of Canada listened. Thank you. Merci. Hachapka.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hello. Bonjour. Isuela. I want to start by thanking Grand Chief Ed John for his kind introduction and for his note about pronunciations. When you're known as Seamus, Oregon for most of your life, you really appreciate it, trust me. I want to thank Elder Bob Baker for that thoughtful opening prayer, too. I I want to thank everybody who took me aside this morning and congratulated me. I don't understand why every one of you felt the need to laugh immediately after you said that. But I am honored to be here with you today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet all of you as we gather here on Coast Salish, territory of Musqueam Indian Band, Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and Squamish Nation. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have been chosen to sit through my first speech as Minister of Indigenous Services. I want to thank the First Nations Leadership Council for collaborating with Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations staff to co-host this 7th joint gathering. And I want to acknowledge the presence, of course, of Assembly First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde, who I saw on my first day in the role, and who immediately told me that I was going on a sweat with him. And I said yes. And he told me that he had spoken to my colleague, the Minister of Heritage, Pablo Rodriguez, about that. And I don't think at that point you had asked him about it, because when I went up and said, Pablo, I'll see you at the sweat lodge, he looked at me like, what are you talking? Pablo, I'm a married man, it's all good. I want to thank you. Thank you. You're never sure how the line is going to go, so it's good when it lands well. They not always will, you know. I want to thank First Nation Leadership Council members. Of course, congratulations to Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, celebrating his 20th year as President of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, celebrating its 50th anniversary. I want to recognize chiefs and council members, administrators from First Nations communities from across BC. I want to acknowledge those who traveled great distances to be here today. Representatives from First Nations institutions and organizations, of course, senior officials from the federal and provincial governments. I especially, if I could, because I spent 5 years as a staffer, I want to thank all the political staffers who are out there too. I know. I am humbled to take on this critical portfolio as only the 2nd Minister of Indigenous Services. Minister Jane Philpott, my friend, did extraordinary work in a short period of time. She earned the respect for the trust that she developed and for the results that she delivered. And I want to reassure you that I am determined to continue the tremendous momentum that you have created together with her, with us, and that is already underway. We will not slow down. We will not slow down. My goal is to hit the ground running and to keep delivering results for you. It was important for me to come to BC so early in my new role because the transformational work you are doing in such areas as education and healthcare is exemplary. I intend to continue to work in partnership with you to build on what was achieved in the last year and a half. This is not the time to slow down. This is the time to demonstrate the government's resolve to follow through on promises made to First Nations. By working together with Indigenous partners, significant progress has been made in our 5 priority areas, including education, healthcare, child and family services, infrastructure, and economic prosperity. But we all know that a lot more remains to be done. We all know that. To close socioeconomic gaps, to improve service delivery, and improve the lives of First Nations right across Canada. BC First Nations have the reputation of being innovative, collaborative, progressive, and solutions-focused. That is a beautiful dog. He looks like he'll be a friendly audience, so he's got it. There we go. As many of you know, I did live television every morning for 10 years. You can take on anything. Welcoming to our newest audience member. You are leading the way on things like First Nations land management, exercising First Nations jurisdiction over child and family services, First Nations control over First Nations education, and moving toward 10-year grants. Let me spend a few minutes on child and family well-being. It is simply unacceptable that Indigenous children across the country continue to be taken away from their families, communities, and cultures and placed in foster care in private homes. On November 30th, Minister Philpott, together with Assembly First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Natan Obed, Métis National Council President Clement Chartier, announced that the Government of Canada intends to introduce co-developed legislation on Indigenous child and family services in early 2019. I want to assure you that this continues to be our top priority. This cabinet shuffle does not affect this timeline. It does not affect this timeline. We have the full support of the Prime Minister to introduce it in the House of Commons very shortly. Very shortly. Very shortly. Right now, we are continuing to engage with Indigenous partners as well as provinces and territories to move on this as quickly as we possibly can. The proposed legislation marks a turning point in addressing this humanitarian crisis in Canada. The support of BC First Nations and technical experts has been instrumental in this co-developed legislation process. We know that Indigenous children and families need to stay together. We also know that First Nations children need access to quality education so that they can fulfill their potential. Later today, I will celebrate the signing of the BC Tripartite Education Agreement with the First Nations Education Steering Committee and the provincial government here in BC. The BC First Nations education system is the result of more than 20 years of hard work and dedication by BC First Nations. It delivers quality education for First Nations students who are in First Nations-run, provincial, or independent schools. It is one of the strongest examples of First Nations control of First Nations education in Canada. Senator Murray Sinclair has said that education got us into this mess and education will get us out of it. We must work together to fulfill the right of First Nations children to access quality and culturally appropriate education, as outlined in UNDRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. Finally, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that 2018 was a very difficult year for First Nations with floods and landslides and windstorms impacting many BC communities. The devastating wildfire season also surpassed 2017 as the worst on record, impacting many First Nations. Tahltan First Nation was one of the hardest hit. I appreciate Chief McLean, along with Chiefs Newski and Alphonse, taking the time to share their recommendations on emergency management with this gathering. Your strength and courage in the face of tremendous adversity is inspirational. I want you to know that the Government of Canada stands with you and other First Nations communities affected by emergencies as you rebuild and recover. There's a lot of work to be done to fully include First Nations in the emergency management system and to ensure that you have the necessary resources to protect and support your communities. And I know that work is well underway on a tripartite emergency management memorandum of understanding. I will do my best, my utmost, to ensure your communities have the resources you need going forward. I stand before you today ready and wanting to listen. And I think now is when I'm going to go off script. That always makes people who work for me sweat a little. Some of you have graciously acknowledged that you want to, that you'll be patient. And I think you just meant it as a to be cordial. I appreciate it. I actually want your impatience. I want you to keep my feet to the fire. You've waited long enough. I'm not slowing down. I'm not slowing this process down. I'm not slowing your projects down. A lot of you are elected officials, like me. So let me just speak candidly. Cabinet shuffles are tough. Change is tough, especially when you have momentum. And I know that Minister Wilson-Raybould is a friend and a colleague with a long history with many people in this room. In 3.5 years, she has become a friend of mine and a colleague. And let me just explain to you briefly our cabinet room. That is the government of Canada. The National Chief was right to point out, the other agencies, how important they are, how important officials are. But at the end of the day, it's that room. It's a table. It's a nice table. But it's a table, surrounded by people that the Prime Minister has chosen to sit there and work things out as a government. Officials periodically come in and out, but nobody knows what goes in that room except for people at that table. And while the media and many others kind of make it out to be that any one of us is exclusive to this file, I am the Minister of Indigenous Services. Carolyn is over there and she does that. Other ministers are over there and they do this. Those are areas of concentration. Those are areas where we have to deliver. But the priorities are set in that room. And this relationship with you is our priority. And that does not change. Minister Wilson-Raybould, Minister Bennett, me, the new Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Finance, sit around that room and we discuss this relationship collectively. The chair of the Reconciliation Cabinet Committee, which sees many projects come forward, is chaired by the Minister of International Trade. I'm the vice chair. I was as Minister of Veterans Affairs. This is a priority for each and every one of us. Having Jane Philpott as President of Treasury Board is a nice place to have Jane Philpott, given her experience of this past 1.5 years. And something that the National Chief didn't mention to you, and not many people know, is that when I was named Minister of Indigenous Services, I was also named Vice Chair of Treasury Board. Not bad. Not bad. In other words, collectively around that table, we maintain that priority under the leadership of a Prime Minister that is determined to make this work. That after 3 budgets and $17 billion in new funding, we are beginning to do the work that needs to be done. We know with all humility that there is much more work to do. Shuffles happen quickly, very quickly, and I'll let you in on a little story. I was actually on Fogo Island, Newfoundland, which is an island off of Newfoundland that, believe it or not, is named by the Flat Earth Society, and yes, they exist. It was named as one of the 4 corners of the ends of the earth. It feels like that. And my husband works there. He had to work through Christmas, so I went up there with him. And the morning that we left to take the ferry to go back to the mainland of Newfoundland, I remember very clearly I decided that I'd wait till we got back to our house in St. John's before I showered and shaved, because we're just taking the drive, the ferry ride, and the drive back to St. John's. And I put on my jacket, my boots. We got in the car with our 2 dogs. We packed up the whole truck because he was leaving for 2 months while the inn was closed where he works. And we took the ferry ferry got in to a lovely little place called Farewell, Newfoundland. As you know, Newfoundland's got some great names for its communities. Some racier than others, but Farewell is a very nice name. And 15 minutes into our drive, they said, "We need you in Ottawa now. We need you in Ottawa tonight. Don't worry, it's all good. But we need you tonight. You need to meet with the Prime Minister." I said, "I haven't shaved or showered." In fact, I don't even have a shirt with a collar on me. So I showed up at the Prime Minister's office after a flight from Gander to Halifax and Halifax to Ottawa, and they drove me immediately to the Prime Minister's office. And the jacket I was wearing was from my best friend in high school in Labrador, Clint Davis, from the Naut'sa group of companies with a big Inukshuk on it. And I was wearing my sealskin boots. And the Prime Minister said, "You are never going to guess where you're going now." I grew up in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador. I moved there when I was a kid. Ed, it's funny, you talk about Christian brothers, and growing up in St. John's, I used to joke that my idea of diversity was Protestants. Exotic people. So when we moved to Labrador, because my dad got a job in Labrador, I met Innu and Inuit for the first time. Most people growing up in the South or even on the island of Newfoundland don't meet Indigenous people. And there was only one road that was leading out of Happy Valley Goose Bay at the time, and that was to Northwest River and the Innu town then known as Sheshashit. And I won't get into it, but it had such a deep impact on me that the 5 years of my academic career have been dedicated to Indigenous issues. And the 5 years I spent in government were at 3 tables for the Labrador Innu, now the government of Nunasivut and Nunatulivut. And then life takes you in a crazy place, and I became a journalist, and I was on a morning show. And I say that, not saying that I have any credentials going into this job. You can't have any credentials going into this job. But I want you to know, because it would be wrong for me not to tell you, that my heart is with this. My heart is here. I'm grateful for the benefit of the doubt. But I demand and I want your impatience. And I promise I will do my very best to deliver for you. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, ministers. And so we now turn to the part for the remainder of our time until lunch for the diplomatic impatient Q&A. Are there any questions? We do have some mic runners. Chief Spahan over here to my right. Chief Lewis, second.
Chief Lewis. Where's Chief Lewis?
Antla and Squash Lease Behan Cook Bevan Sletku in the Catholic Nation. I'd like to say thank you to the host nations for allowing us to do this important work on their unceded territory. Thank you for the great speeches. Welcome for your new job, ministers, Seamus, O'Regan. Question for Minister Bennett. I posed this question yesterday to Joe Wild, but I also posed this question during the Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa in December to you, Minister Bennett. So I'd like to pose the question again, because for 2 years in a row, this question has not been answered. Almost a year and a half ago, the Federal Court of Appeal found that the Minister of Indian Affairs, your predecessor, breached his fiduciary duty to Coldwater when he approved to transfer the Trans Mountain Pipeline easement through our reserve from Terracin Inc. to Kinder Morgan. By the time of the court's decision on September 26, 2017, you had taken over as the minister, and the court expressly referred the matter back to you as the minister for redetermination in accordance with the court's reasons. Since then, we have been trying to get you to deal with us with this matter, but to no avail. Almost a year later, the same court sent the Trans Mountain Expansion Project back for reconsideration when we proved that your government failed in its duty to consult with us in respect of the expansion. On that one, your government is moving very quickly, presumably because, as your government keeps saying, you are determined to get the expanded pipeline built. You obviously consider the outstanding obligations regarding the existing pipeline on our reserve to be a lower priority than getting the expansion built. My question for you is this: why have you not followed the court's direction to reconsider and address the breach of fiduciary duty in respect of the existing pipeline in our reserve? And why are you prioritizing the expansion, which you want, over resolving the problems with the existing pipeline, which Coldwater wants addressed? Cookstram.
Thank you very much. Yeah, whatever you're comfortable with.
Thank you, Chief, for that. And I understand the officials are meeting next week, I think, with Deputy Minister Tremblay. And I think that we want to deal with any outstanding obligations on existing pipeline. And the whole issue, I think, with the court was around accommodation and making sure that that rights are honored and accommodation is dealt with. So maybe if
So, Chief, thanks for the questions. I spoke yesterday with Deputy Minister at Natural Resources, Christine Tremblay. Despite her last name, she's not my sister, neither my wife. We agree that you're right. There's the issue of the existing pipeline and the issue of the expansions. So we agree that officials from the two departments would be meeting with you. They may have been trying to reach you, actually. And we hope that this meeting can happen next week. I'm told that the 28th of January is the date for the meeting. So we will look at the different options. You're right, it's a distinction between the expansion and the decision of the court that is about the existing pipeline. And we need to look at those two issues, not necessarily those together, but actually kind of advance on both for sure over the next few months and years.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Tremblay. And so we turn for further questions for Minister Bennett and Minister O'Regan. Chief Lewis.
Byron Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. I have three quick questions on there, and the first one deals with the need for government to actually address smaller issues that actually affect First Nations and can make a huge difference in our people. The first one is collection of credit ratings on reserve and the lack of that, and what happens in First Nations communities that people like TransUnion or Equifax or anything else does not collect information, whether it's on a band council or on an individual. And what this means is that our bands who do business with banks and others over 100 and, you look at usually over 100 million, not 100, about $1 million and up for housing alone with banks, that what we get is usually about prime plus 2. We don't get preferred client status that would be established established on the fact if we actually had a credit rating or could establish a credit rating. And when you talk to individuals and that can't establish their own credit, yet they're going into banks, some of them are actually doing business plans and what have you, and yet when they go into a bank, they say, well, that's a wonderful business plan you got here, but you don't have a credit rating. And yet, the average Aboriginal person who has a home paid about an average of $170,000 for that home, and yet that's not recorded anywhere. That needs to change. And the next is our ability when we're looking at business. We need the ability to create crown corporations, because crown corporations are hybrid between a government and basically a business. And nowhere else have crown corporations a need for them or in Aboriginal communities, because they're the prime form of business. And how we're created under these is that you have you set up a crown, or you set up a corporation, then you set up another committee, a committee under there to manage money but can't spend it. Then you create another committee that basically advises, which is a hybrid between your board and your council, to advise where the money can be spent. The problem with this is that's the same process that's used by drug dealers and money launderers. So whenever it goes through FinTrack, it's First Nations businesses afloat to the top and causes so much stress. We need the ability to actually create crown corporations and businesses for our communities on the same par as the province and the federal government. And that is something that can be done under Section 9124, because there isn't too many people in this room that are willing to accept provincial jurisdiction over our lands or interests. So that is the second question. Third one is support, because I really do believe that the future of First Nations in economics is international trade. We are way better off to looking at the opportunities of a population of 7.7 billion as we are is 3 billion, and when you look 36 million, I should say. And when you look at that, that also includes our ability to actually, even in agriculture, we have to buy in there under a quota system that we're already at a disadvantage against people who have already made the investment, people that already paid off their equipment, people that already have done this, and we're coming in having to pay all three without the ability to actually, and without the purchase of that quota. So what we really need is for government to start putting more emphasis on economic development, because that has proven over and over again as one of the best means to alleviate social and economic conditions amongst First Nations.
Thank you very much, Chief Lewis. As the ministers are gathering their thoughts, just in the interest of our time, I'll note that we have the three red shirts at three speakers, so we'll take Mr. Hardy, Mr. George, President Sayers, and then we'll break for the lunch. Sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to get to that. Ministers?
I even though it's probably not my area, it's something that I've heard a great deal about in terms of this issue of credit ratings. And I think because Equifax and the usual suspects don't really understand or choose not to deal with First Nations in the way that you have described, there are other organizations that are moving in. And I know in Minister Haiju's riding, there are a couple of, I think, there's a couple that there are organizations that are moving in to do this differently, that really will be specific for what a credit rating for a First Nation should look like, and they are, I think, ending up with some success in explaining what the ability to borrow based on this unique issue of credit. Yeah.
I'll pass this over to JF to give the particulars, but I just wanted to add too that anything that we can do to get out of the way of your ambition and the prosperity of your communities, we want to get out of the way. We want to cut the red tape and get rid of it. I always say about red tape, a lot of it just accumulates over time. I mean, a lot of it is there for the best of intentions, either for reasons of accountability, or other principles that are important at the time, but then they accumulate over time and they become, as the National Chief said, moldy. And we need to stay vigilant on it, but I'll let JF speak to the particulars.
Thanks for all those ideas. That was a lot in a really short time frame. On your first point, we should pursue the discussion. As you know, we're working on a housing innovation strategy where we're trying to see alternatives to the existing model, which include exactly it is how do you actually help First Nations to have access to better credit. And also, there's also work done by FNFA on monetarization, where you could also use the funding coming from the Fed over the next years as a capital that allow you to actually kind of borrow fund money at a better rate. So I would be more than pleased to engage with you on this. On the Crown Corporation, I think, the point you're making is a good one. We've got a lot of institutions over there. We've got the FAI, as you know, and we've got other institutions. There's a lot of sophisticated First Nations businesses out there, too. I think it's the right questions to ask is what is the right format, and I would be pleased to get that discussion with you if we want to help it to grow more. Because you talked about international trade, but I would say, including in Canada, how do you support the businesses who are established and sometimes close to the band or to the community to actually perform across the country and get the chance to grow across the country? If I look at procurement at the federal level, for example, First Nation and Indigenous businesses are really underrepresented. And that's something that really needs to change. And how do we help those businesses to actually grow and get that capacity to be able to compete on the Canadian market and more, again, on the international market?
Thank you very much. Mr. Hardy, who brought us some additional fisheries bullets earlier.
Well, Mr. Bennett and Mr. O'Regan?
Regan.
Just having fun. Hey, first and foremost, again, Councillor with the Comox First Nation. Again, thanks to Canada. We were notified yesterday of some funding to help us get some water and sewer to our Puntlands Reserve number 2. We've been working on that project for 30 plus years, so thank you, Canada, for that, for that assistance. I did have a question for Minister Bennett in regards to her mention of the oversight mechanism or body that is in place. Are First Nations involved in that process or that table? That was my question. And then with my Comox First Nation hat, again, with regards to the treaty process, we're in stage 6. We're really struggling with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have negotiators that continuously come to our table for well over 4 years that continue to say we don't have any mandates. So, Mr. Bennett, you made a remark with regards to we need to be or have more direct action. We're hoping that maybe when you go back to Ottawa that you're having a serious conversation with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans with regards to the treaty issues out here, because again, from a Comox perspective, we don't have a fisheries chapter. We're probably not going to sign off on a treaty. Thanks.
Is there a need for...
Thank you for that. And up to this point, I think it's been the self-governing nations that have been part of the consultation on the oversight body. I mean, they've really, I think since 2007, have been sending letters as to what they really would like to see. But I think everyone will be included in this next round of really us designing what treaty implementation looks like in terms of the honor of the Crown. And the issue of fish is huge. It's an economic component. I think Seamus will agree that it's something that comes up a lot at the Reconciliation Committee of Cabinet. I think Joe will tell you that just rethinking the approach to fish and economic development and the Marshall decision and all of these things are really, I think, need to be tackled. And I think that I think Minister Wilkinson is on it, and we will work with you on this, because, as they say, no treaty without fish. Or this is very serious to all of us. This is a way of living. I think for us to go to communities and see those boats up on the shore, like it just breaks your heart. And so we want to work on this, and it's been a very difficult. And I mean, I think everybody in this room knows that when we say whole of government, there are some departments that have been pretty entrenched in their ways, and we're very excited by the promise of a new way of looking at this as an element of economic development, and an obvious one.
Dan?
Good afternoon. Good morning. Can you hear me? Now you can. Dan Smith, Weekend Nation. I'm the tribal manager here, and it's an interesting situation because on my grandmother's side, I have Chief Frank Johnson. On my grandfather's side, I have Chief Christopher Roberts. So I'm blessed with both. I want to thank Grand Chief Ed John. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is really a comment to all that sit there that are working for the federal government. And I want to just say that systemic change is necessary as quickly as possible, because the continuity of respective governments, whether it's the federal government Liberals or if it's the NDP government, we have in front of us looming elections. And we need systemic change as soon as possible to address the issues that all Indigenous communities are facing at this time. We have First Nations that are maybe in co-management, third-party management, and they have to do the compliance reports. If they don't meet the compliance report, then the department claws back X number of dollars. And yet the First Nation has expended those dollars in good faith. So that has to be addressed as well. Both ministers have mentioned about socioeconomic initiatives. I'm particularly interested in the commitment to child and family. Because when you start to talk about child and family, we start to talk about the impoverished families. Then we start to talk about housing for the respective First Nations. We're lacking in housing. And what takes place, of course, is we have CMHC, we have BC Native Housing, we have the announcement by the NDP about $500 million for off and on reserve for the next 10 years. Then we have housing in the Department of Indigenous Service Canada, or New Relations. That has to be facilitated, expedited, before the looming election starts to come about. So for all of the ministers, how are we going to initiate this? How are we going to expedite it? Because we are ready and willing in all of the First Nations in particular. So the one last thing we have to talk about, because we talked about treaty and negotiating treaties, is the costing of governance, the true costing of governance. It is more than what the department provides to each of the First Nations. And so all First Nations are underfunded and expected to report and be in compliance to the 37 various programs that the department has, when we only have maybe 20, 40, maybe 100 people in the community. So we don't have the managers have the support staff. It's the support staff we do not have. Systemic change is required ASAP in order to take advantage of the commitments that you have articulated to us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ministers.
I'll just start with the last one, which is, again, the true costing issue. And that was that fancy slide that was up there was exactly what the self-governing nations have said. Small, medium, large. They need to know stable, predictable funding, but the true costs of running their government, having public servants properly paid, not being poached to other places, that this is an ongoing commitment for us to fix this so that people can actually run their governments. And I think the third-party management and all of that, those rest within Indigenous services, but we knew, I mean, back to Chuck Strahl, that this doesn't work. You're not building capacity. You've got third-party managers costing huge amounts of money, not building capacity. It costs too much, and it's not effective. So I think that's why we're working hard to make those changes.
One of the abiding principles, and I mean, you see it in everything that Carolyn does, everything that Jane had done. You know, this is about achieving results. It's also about the overriding principle that services should be in the control of people who are closest to those services. I mean, that is an overriding principle, and everything that we're doing in partnership with you is getting those services to you, close to you, so those decisions can be made with the sensitivity that comes from the people who receive those services. And you know, that's a principle we'll abide by. I wanted to talk, you know, directly about you know, the child and family services. So, you know, that legislation will be introduced very soon. And politically, in terms of what you could do to support that, I would say speak to your member of parliament and speak to your senators. I do not believe this is a Liberal issue. I think this is a Government of Canada issue. I think that this is beyond partisan politics. We need to make sure that everybody is rowing together. So I would ask you, you know, if you want to make sure that this gets through with a common understanding of this room, that we do have a very tight timeline, lobby. That would be a tremendous help to us. Did you want to add anything, JF?
Thank you for your comments. I think we all agree and on the need to change this third-party approach and management. And we've got less than ever in terms of First Nations. It's going down in terms of numbers. I think I saw Paul Stoppel this year, who's going to be talking later on the new fiscal relationship. Part of it is exactly it, which is how do you make sure that you support First Nations to actually improve their financial credit, but not us doing that. How do you work with actually First Nation institutions to make it happen? How do we change the approach, and an approach that is actually about the needs, about the capacity needs, about what to do to improve the situation, rather than just going at the bottom with the third-party managers and not knowing exactly how you're going to get out of this. So that's actually something that is central to the vision and to the new approach of this government. Totally agree with you of the systemic change that is needed. That's what our ministers have been telling us, and this government has been asking us for years, and that's what we're working on. And when people say, oh my God, my reaction is what is so good in the status quo that we need to protect. So hearing you on this, that's clearly where we're going.
Let me just very quickly, if I could, just add something in terms of being results-oriented. You know, I've been told on several occasions I have big shoes to fill. In Jane Philpott, I also have a lot to live up to in the moment with sitting next to this minister, with the dedication and heart that she's put into it. And in fact, I took the liberty of rearranging our speaking order today, because I wanted to demonstrate to you the reality. I mean, it was meant to be Carolyn up here, give a speech, answer questions, then me come up here, give a speech, answer questions. I really wanted us on the stage together. This is where we sit at the cabinet table. We sit together. This is how we will operate. This is how we will work, hand in glove, to achieve those results in partnership with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will turn here for the last question. I do want to note that there were a number of others who wished to ask questions. There were several others, and I wasn't able to get to you. And even the national chief himself was advocating on your behalf. And I would point out that when I serve as a Speaker of the Assembly of First Nations, I am in your hands at that point. Here I have other responsibilities. President Sayers.
Thank you. Minister O'Regan, I wanted to bring to your attention the need for more services money in regards to the effects of climate change on our communities in British Columbia. I could talk to you about climate change, but I won't. We need more money for capacity building, equipment, and our ability to defend our homes from fires, from flooding, and we don't have that. The federal government gives the province money for emergency services, then we're subject to their priorities and not ours. When there are fires, it destroys the ecosystems. You can't hunt, you can't trap, sometimes you can't fish. When the power goes down for 8, 10, 12 days or more, food gets destroyed in the freezers. We need to become grid independent. We need to have money for holes in emergency services. In Nut'sa territories, we had 5 fishermen go missing, and yes, there was a search. But our people go out much longer than Coast Guard and police, and there was no money. And it takes money to go out for those resources. We had a community that was without water for days because of aging infrastructure. We need to have those kinds of money. And the region, of course, is subject to the federal money. But we are there in our communities. We can defend our communities. We're there. And we do what we can, but we need more. And this has really impacted us in the past 2 years, the worst fire seasons ever. And if we don't act on climate change and stop approving some of those big projects that are greenhouse gas emitting, this is going to get worse. But I really wanted to bring this to your attention because it affects all of us in our communities. We're seeing creeks turn into raging rivers. There are things that are happening out there that never happened before. And we need to be preventative. We can't just be post and then trying to clean up afterwards. And I'd like to see us be much better prepared. And we are working on it, but we need help. We need more help. Thank you.
As I said to you, Jane and I continue to work as cabinet colleagues, but also on Treasury Board. So I sit by her side as well, twice a week on Treasury Board, and we've already discussed this in depth. She is very clear. I've been briefed on it by officials of just what a priority it is. Catherine McKenna sits on the Reconciliation Cabinet Committee as well. She is very much aware of how important this is. This is about forestry management ultimately, but it is also about capacity building and my point earlier about an overriding principle of making sure those services are delivered on the ground, the closest, and that is in everybody's best interests. So I hear you loud and clear. Did you want to add something? Yeah.
Well, I think just that we heard very clearly that the bilateral relationship with BC was unacceptable, and we had to move to a trilateral with First Nations. That I think the upset around the fighting of the forest fires and the capacity that existed in your nations while Australians show up is pretty frustrating. But the idea of forest management and what traditional practice would say is, I think, going to lead it. Joyce Murray's husband stopped me at the airport to say that just planting conifers instead of mixed forest just is like a fire track, and I think that we want to listen to the people who know about, how you protect your communities in a real management plan. But also, I know that Joe Alphonse and others are talking about making sure that the capacity that exists in certain nations can be shared with other nations, so that they can also be self-sufficient on these things. So I think there's, I think this is an area that we really will work together on and make sure that again, that you need resources to not only fight when it happens, but to really listen to the elders and be able to put in place the prevention that is needed.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much for that. Once again, I do extend my apologies to those we were not able to get to. I do want to let you know we have a bit more work to do before we break to our lunch, which we are already into that hour. I take some comfort in knowing that this is not your only avenue for accessing these ministers and these senior officials, and so there's many other opportunities for that, both today and as we go through the remainder of the year. I wanted to note that Ministers Bennett and Minister O'Regan have spoken well, and they've been joined by the Grand Chief and the senior officials, and of course from the questioners, and sort of really the eloquence of all of you is to be appreciated. And as did the National Chief this morning, I ask you to join with Jesse and I as we thank the panel and the ministers and lift them up.
Thank you very much. That concludes our morning comments, but I have a few housekeeping announcements to make before we go to the blessing of the meal, again by Elder Bob Baker. So I ask for just a few more moments of your attention. Reminder about the client service questionnaires at the Ask Me booth. Please fill those out over the lunch hour and return completed questionnaires to them. We'll be doing a prize draw at the end of lunch. If you would like a plate brought to you, as elders especially, but anyone with needing that extra support, if you could just raise your hand right now, and volunteers will come to you and find out what you want for lunch, and they can bring you a plate. This is a really nice opportunity to be treated nicely, a little self-care for hardworking folks. So keep your hand in the air until a volunteer comes to you. I also want to note that for the youth or the young at heart, there is a screening of the Haida film, Edge of the Knife, that begins almost immediately in the Mackenzie room. So we would ask that, again, folks let elders, those youth, diabetics, or anyone else that needs priority take a first pass at the lunch buffet. Please note, we are going to have a prayer in just a moment. So if you could be quiet for 2 more minutes, that would be much appreciated. I've also been asked to wish a happy birthday to Councillor Jenny Martin. And we'll go now to the blessing. So please help me welcome Elder Bob Baker to the stage for the lunch blessing.
Thank you. My stool. OCM. I wanted to share a song with you that kind of addresses our time together here. And at this time of year, when all the eagles are gathering in our territory because of the salmon that have done their thing, and some of them are all spawned out. So we've got salmon everywhere, and there's a big potlatch going on up in our Squamish Valley. The song I want to share with you is called Eskaktaspakos, Gathering of Eagles. When eagles come together, what do they do? What do they share? Same as us, like human beings. Information on where they've been, stories of their life. They look for a mate. All kinds of things go on when the eagles come together. Spread a few rumors, you know how it goes. Eskaktaspakos, this song is I started singing this song in 1977 while I was as a maintenance worker over in Park Royal, and went home and recorded it and asked if anybody knew where the song came from. But it is the first song I received, and I just wanted to share a little bit with you that the song has been taken by a music writer and rescored for a 90-piece orchestra, and has been shared with schools across Canada. And in an act of reconciliation, when the schools in West Vancouver, where I work as a consultant, a couple of schools over there sing the song as a part of their national anthem on assembly days. So it is, we're making short steps, but we're making positive steps that are, and I think a lot of people are benefiting from it. But that is a little bit of background on the song. And it is with this song that I'd like to add that we ask the Creator to bless the hands that prepared the food, that gathered the food, and to bless all of us here that are going to be partaking in this meal, in that it provides us with the strength and good health that we always can use when we're going through things that require energy. So with that, I would like to again share that you can take this moment. This moment is like medicine that you can use for whatever purpose, for yourself or for those that are struggling, and just to have that time to go with the ancestors' medicine, the ancestors' spirituality. So I thank you for this opportunity. OCM, Eskaktaspakos. Yo! Makwitsi. Inagata Davida. Thank you, OCM.
Thank you so much, Elder Baker. Just noting the time that we're starting lunch a little later, we will reconvene the afternoon at 1:10 instead of 1 o'clock. So 1:10 will be reconvening in plenary. And again, just to mention that if we could let the elders and youth in the room or anyone else that needs first crack at the lunch table, to let them go first while the rest of us wait 15 or 20 minutes before we take our turn.